The world is changing fast. China pauses its trade war with the US, but is this peace or just a calm before the next global storm? Across the ocean, Washington finally loses faith in Putin. No deal, no trust, no future for the Kremlin. And Ukraine hitting back harder than ever. Explosions rip through Russian oil plants. The empire's lifeline is burning. Welcome to Ukraine Today. I'm Zorislava Kolesnikova. Stay tuned because the global game is just getting started. China assesses tariffs, truce or calm before the storm. China has announced a one-year suspension of additional 24% tariff on American goods. But the base 10% tariffs introduced earlier in response to Trump's trade measures still remains. Is this the beginning of a thaw between Washington and Beijing, or just the calm before the next big trade war?
A truce or the calm before the storm? China has announced the suspension of an additional 24% tariff on American goods. The relief will last for a year, but at the same time, the base tariff of 10%, which was introduced in response to a similar tariff imposed by Trump in April, remains in place.
The US is the largest market for goods, and China is the largest producer of goods. How does China make money? By supplying its products to the largest markets. As we noted, the US is the primary one.
The decision on the new agreement was made after a meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, according to Reuters. Thanks to this, tariffs of up to 15% on certain types of agricultural products from the US have also been lifted.
From an economic standpoint, China and the US can't really be in different, let's say, not just camps, but be adversaries. In fact, they are in different camps since they're competing over which of them is the leading economy.
China's Ministry of Finance noted that starting March 4th, they will suspend all tariffs on soybeans and other U.S. agricultural products, including corn, wheat, sorghum, and chicken. It was stated that this decision was made in accordance with the consensus reached during economic and trade consultations between China and the U.S.
Therefore, despite all the political ambitions and attempts to show that we can compete, that we will be leaders, and so on and so forth, I emphasize from the perspective of China's economic interests, it needs the US.
The US and China have also agreed to establish direct communication between their armed forces. As stated by Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth, this will help prevent potential conflicts between the countries. Another step China has taken towards the US is its refusal to import Russian oil. According to Bloomberg, major state-owned companies and smaller private enterprises in China have canceled nearly half of their oil shipments from Russia after the US imposed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil in October. And
when the question arises of whom China will choose, Russia or the US, one must understand a simple thing. There is the US, and one of its states, the largest, is California. California's economy is twice the size of Russia's economy, just one state. The United States of America is like two Russian economies. Naturally, for China, the US is much more important than Russia.
Putin absolutely does not want to let go of one of his few remaining partners, so he sent his prime minister with greetings to Beijing. As a result of the negotiations, the parties signed about 10 documents on cooperation in the fields of energy, space, and high technology.
Russia is of interest to China as a supplier of raw materials and goods. But Russia doesn't really have much choice except to sell everything to China. China understands that Russia depends on it and that Russia won't take any steps against it. And with America, it's interesting that this is happening so soon.
According to Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, Russia is sinking ever deeper into economic dependence on China. Raw material projects in the Far East and Siberia are turning the region into a resource base for China, while local communities remain excluded from the promised benefits.
Washington loses faith in Putin. No deal, no trust, no future. Across the ocean, the illusion is gone. The Trump administration no longer believes in any deal with the Kremlin, not on peace, not on arms control. Has Washington finally seen Putin's for who is he really? Is a dictator who only understands force.
It seems that across the ocean they've finally become disillusioned with Putin. And it looks like the Trump administration no longer believes it's possible to reach an agreement with the Kremlin, whether on peace or arms control. Now, instead of dialogue, it's about building up power and supporting allies. The US is strengthening Europe's defense, supplying Ukraine with the latest weaponry, and returning to a strategy of deterrence. And in Moscow, this has clearly made people nervous.
Russia has always strictly adhered to and continues to adhere to all of its solemn obligations and responsibilities under the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. This unwavering commitment to the treaty remains a cornerstone of Russia's policy. And we have no plans, absolutely no plans whatsoever, to abandon or relinquish these important obligations and responsibilities. At the same time, it is indeed true that, as I clearly stated in my address to the Federal Assembly in the year 2023, if the United States of America or any other states that are parties to the relevant international treaty conduct such nuclear tests or similar activities, then the Russian Federation will also unfortunately have to take appropriate and corresponding reciprocal measures in response. This is not our preferred course of action, but it is a necessary step to maintain balance and ensure the security and stability of all parties involved. Our commitment remains firm, but we must be prepared to act if circumstances require it.
Putin instructed his loyal servants to sniff out exactly what threat the American plans pose.
I am instructing that everything possible be done in order to gather additional and relevant information on this important issue, and to conduct a careful and thorough analysis of the matter within the Security Council, ensuring that all aspects are properly considered and discussed. And to submit coordinated proposals regarding the possible commencement of work to prepare for nuclear weapons testing.
In particular, at the next meeting of the Russian Security Council, the bunker dweller was briefed about the US intention to deploy Dark Eagle missile systems in Europe and the Asia-Pacific region.
At the end of this year, the US plans to adopt a new Dark Eagle medium-range missile system, equipped with hypersonic missiles with a range of 5,500 kilometers. And in the future, the deployment of this system is scheduled to be implemented in Europe and the Asia-Pacific region. The flight time of such a missile from German territory, where this missile system is planned to be stationed, to targets in central Russia will be about 6 to 7 minutes.
Belousov also informed Putin that the United States is working on the development of a new intercontinental ballistic missile, the Sentinel, with a range of 13,000 kilometers, a Columbia-class strategic nuclear submarine, and the heavy bomber B-21 Raider. Donald Trump, in turn, confirmed his intention to resume nuclear testing. The process will begin immediately, he stated in a video address published on the Truth social platform. According to him, other countries are already testing new combat systems, and America must do the same to maintain the balance of power.
This resembles a kind of dance between the Russian and American partners. Still, Russia and Putin are cautiously taking on the role of the follower in this tango, in this dance. And I don't think Russia will officially announce the resumption of nuclear testing before the Americans do. And in this case, Trump is doing this partly as a response to all these aggressive statements from Putin and the Russian leadership about new weapon systems that could supposedly wipe the entire east coast of the US off the map, or, like the Burevestnik, fly around the Earth for years, emitting some kind of radioactive fumes. And so this is kind of his answer. If, within the context of the overall escalation of the global situation following the deterioration of relations between Russia and the US and the start of the war in Ukraine, such tests could be resumed. By the way, many military personnel, not only in Russia but also in America, China, France and England, will breathe a sigh of relief and will gladly do this, since from their point of view it increases the power of deterrence.
At the same time, Washington is strengthening its capabilities in space. The US Space Force is preparing to deploy 2 new weapon systems designed to jam Russian and Chinese reconnaissance satellites. According to Bloomberg, the Meadowlands and remote sensing terminal systems will complement the already operational counter-communication system, which was adopted in 2020.
The new systems will be distributed around the world and will sometimes be operated remotely. They are intended to counter what US military officials are increasingly describing in stark terms as a growing Chinese space threat to American forces.
According to estimates by the US Space Force, there are currently thousands of satellites in orbit, and hundreds of them are used for surveillance and reconnaissance. They give the adversary the ability to detect aircraft carriers, formations, and logistics. The Pentagon emphasizes that these technologies are purely defensive in nature. However, experts are convinced that this is about establishing a new level of strategic deterrence. And while Washington and Moscow are comparing their nuclear arsenals, Europe is preparing for defense. The EU and NATO are creating a system of military logistics corridors, routes along which, in the event of a threat, equipment, weapons, and troops can be transferred to the eastern flank within a matter of hours. The key hubs are Poland, Germany, Romania, and the Baltic states. The European Commission has already presented the Readiness 2030 plan, a strategy that will unite the continent's infrastructure into a single network. Railways, ports, and airports will operate according to common NATO standards. And Germany will become the main transit hub for Europe's defense.
Ukrainian drones strike Russia oil plants in flames. Ukraine hits back hard. Massive drone strikes rock Russia oil refineries, power plants and energy hubs are burning. Moscow is losing fuel, money and control. It is the start of Russia's total energy collapse.
Military facilities, energy and the oil industry, the war has fully shifted onto Russian territory, and it seems the Ukrainian armed forces have chosen their targets in the occupiers' rear and are increasing their long-range strikes.
One of the main goals is to force Russia to end the war. The aim is to make the cost of this war higher for Russia, so that there is more motivation to bring it to an end.
At the same time, the defense forces are giving Russians more motivation every day. In the past few weeks, not a single night has passed in Russia without something exploding, catching fire, or being destroyed. We've gathered the most high-profile incidents. Undoubtedly, the most striking event regarding Russian blackouts was the Ukrainian armed forces attack on the Moscow region on the night of November 1st. Monitoring channels reported hundreds of drones that flew out to bomb Russia, and they hit their targets. Even though Moscow's power grid held up, entire settlements around the capital were left without electricity. In particular, the Moscow region and the city of Zhukovsky were left in the dark.
Ukraine's armed forces have carried out many strikes on stations and substations, causing blackouts and loss of heating in cities across Russia and occupied territories. Ukraine is targeting Russian energy infrastructure in response to Russia's attacks on Ukraine's power facilities. I believe that in December, this retaliatory campaign will reach a new level, with the use of Flamingo missiles almost on a daily basis.
The campaign to destroy Russia's oil industry is also ongoing. In particular, recent strikes on the Russian oil terminal in Tuapse have been especially effective.
The attack on the Tuapse seaport was quite large-scale, effective, and also spectacular. Local residents began taking photos and recording videos of the attack. The beginning of this attack was also captured on video. Meanwhile, local emergency services issued their usual statements, asking people not to film the aftermath of the strikes. This helps the enemy.
However, what actually helps the Ukrainian armed forces is not the videos made by concerned Russians who, in the 4th year of the war, have suddenly discovered that it is happening right outside their windows, but rather intelligence data, including from Western sources, which makes such precise strikes possible.
As a result of the strike, according to the Russian side's own assessment, Ukrainian UAVs hit the following targets: the central overpass, which is the main hub, at the oil pumping station. And accordingly, we're talking about a strike on an oil tanker, which at the moment of the attack was being loaded.
At the same time, when they succeed, the Ukrainian armed forces manage to kill several birds with one stone with a single strike. In other words, they are destroying an enterprise that is, on the one hand, extremely important to the Russian economy, and on the other, an outright military target.
A strike was carried out on the industrial giant of the Stavropol region, the Stavrolen petrochemical plant in the city of Budyonovsk. This is one of the largest producers of polyethylene, polypropylene, benzene, and other petrochemical components that are actively used in the military-industrial complex.
Analysts note that this was the first time a strike was carried out there. By the way, the plant is located 700 kilometers from Ukraine, and the enterprise supplies raw materials both to the domestic market and for export. This means that this attack damages not only the military-industrial complex, but also the export revenues of the Russian budget. Defense forces are also targeting Russian facilities in the occupied territories. A few days ago, the residents of Crimea felt this especially strongly after one of the largest attacks on the peninsula in the past few months, particularly on oil depots in Vardiske and Sevastopol.
The outcome of this episode is as follows. In just 1 hour, 2 major oil facilities in Crimea were put out of operation. This means a complete loss of stable rear supply for the occupiers in this sector, especially against the backdrop of the destruction and disabling of the largest oil terminal in Feodosia and the general gasoline shortage in Russia itself, which, I remind you, is the only source for replenishing Crimea's oil depots.
Most recently, on the night of November 4th, drones and Storm Shadow missiles from the defense forces managed to damage both Russian energy infrastructure and oil depots, as well as significantly complicate their presence in the occupied territories, effectively disabling all military facilities in the affected area.
Ukrainian drones struck thermal power plants and substations in Luhansk, Alchevsk, Khadivka, and Pervomaisk. These are temporarily occupied territories of Luhansk region. There have been reports of widespread power outages for consumers, blockades on the territory of the Russian Federation in the past 24 hours, drone strikes by the Ukrainian Defense Forces, Kursk region. This is Zheleznogorsk. Due to the substation, the city is completely without power. Lipetsk region, this is the PSU's traction substation, Usman. And accordingly, the city of Orel. A strike was carried out on the Oral CHP, combined heat and power plant. That's regarding the blackout.
As for military targets, analysts call one of the most successful long-range attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces the explosions at the dam near Belgorod. The strike was so precise that no civilians were harmed. However, Russian units in the Kharkiv region were cut off from their own forces due to the flooding, and the offensive failed.
An important objective is to strike at Russia's logistical capabilities, ammunition depots, airfields, aircraft and troop concentrations in order to create difficulties for Moscow's war machine. The goal is to hit the centers from which Russia directs operations at the front and from where it can attack Ukraine's strategic infrastructure, including its energy sector.
At the same time, it's far too early for Russians to relax, as announced by the head of the drone systems forces, Madyar. This winter, residents of the Russian Federation will find out what a blackout is, and at the same time he reminded that gas and oil burn perfectly well, obviously hinting at new attacks on oil refineries.
As of November, according to estimates from the Russian side itself, about 40% of oil refineries on the territory of the Russian Federation have already been put out of commission.
Well then, as they say, to be continued.
That's all for today on Ukraine Today. If you stand for truth over propaganda, like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps us expose the Kremlin's lies, defend Ukrainians' voice and keep the world informed. Stay strong, stay informed and stay with Ukraine.